Hello everyone, welcome back. History loves to Photoshop the past. It gives us silk gowns, moonlit chambers, and romantic whispers in the dark. Reality? More like tax debt, grumpy teenagers, and officials with clipboards checking your teeth. Before we dive in, hit like and subscribe to join our global community. Wherever you're watching from, drop your city and your local time in the comments. It's how we turn history into a conversation that belongs to all of us. Headphones on, symmetry achieved, underwear secured. Congratulations, you're officially ready for history our way. Our journey begins with a simple question. How old were you when someone decided your future for you? For a Ming Dynasty concubine, the answer could be 10, sometimes less. Childhood toys traded for powdered skin checks. You'd stand in line with dozens, sometimes hundreds of girls. Everyone pretending not to notice the eunuch staring at their teeth like he was shopping for melons. Some families sold their daughters for survival. Others offered them as gifts to climb political ladders. Either way, congratulations, you're not going home tonight. The empire didn't ask what you wanted. Your parents signed you away. The eunuchs wrote down your measurements, and suddenly your teenage rebellion phase is rescheduled. Forever. And you thought high school uniforms were restrictive. Inside the Forbidden City, your life shifts from fields or village courtyards to regimented rituals. Meals, timed, walks, supervised, makeup, poisonous, literally. They put mercury and lead on their faces to stay pale. Imagine explaining to a dermatologist today, yes, my skin routine involves slow self-destruction, but it's fashionable. Privacy doesn't exist. Eunuchs control doors, letters, even your bedtime. It's less romantic palace and more boarding school with surveillance cameras and zero Wi-Fi. Your housemates? Other concubines. Hundreds of them, each one technically your colleague, but also your competition. Gossip becomes weaponry, and friendship is a coin flip. Today you share hairpins, tomorrow she's whispering that you have freckles. Automatic disqualification in the beauty Olympics of the Ming court. Hierarchy decides everything. At the top sits the empress or empress dowager, queen bee of the hive. Below her, consorts, ranked wives, then the swarm of concubines. You, somewhere at the bottom, unless lightning strikes in the form of imperial affection. Access to the emperor runs through eunuchs, who might delay or forget your request, because they're bribed by someone else. It's less romantic destiny and more waiting room at the DMV, except the prize is survival. Even when you do meet the emperor, don't imagine candlelit confessions. Think speed date. He shows up, you perform perfection, and maybe you're remembered. Or maybe he sneezes mid-conversation, and that's it. You're one shot lost to pollen. Every move you make is designed to protect your family's honour. Ironically, the family that gave you away now depends on you to raise their status. You become a living resume, and failing means collective embarrassment. No pressure. And remember, you're not alone. Some concubines come from Korea or Southeast Asia, sent as tribute. International politics dressed up in silk robes. Imagine being a teenager told, you're going abroad. Exciting, right? Then you realise abroad means locked in someone else's palace forever. The palace walls are painted red, but for you, they might as well be prison bars. Daily life is repetition. Eat, practice etiquette, survive whispers, apply toxic powder, repeat. If you're lucky, you get a glimpse of the garden. If unlucky, you get a lecture on how your bow wasn't low enough. The strangest part? Everyone outside thought this was glamorous. Parents bragged, poets wrote flowery verses, officials recorded your beauty like inventory. Meanwhile, you were trying to remember if you'd already poisoned yourself with lead 3 times this week, or 4. Silence was safety. Talking too much might attract attention. Not talking enough might be called disrespect. Even breathing had etiquette rules. Imagine someone writing you up for ungraceful exhale. Sleep wasn't peaceful either. You shared quarters, and sometimes beds, with women who might one day frame you for treason. Snoring wasn't just annoying, it could be fatal if the wrong ear heard it. Yes, history had death by gossip. The first lesson of survival here isn't beauty, it's invisibility. You learn to nod, to vanish into the group, to make yourself slightly forgettable. Ironically, in a system built on attention, the safest thing is not being noticed. That's daily life, not fireworks, not romance, but small negotiations with rules designed to erase individuality. Imagine being punished because your hairstyle was 2 pins short. That's not a metaphor, it happened. And so the palace becomes a paradox. You live surrounded by luxury, but every bite of food, every brushstroke of makeup, every whispered rumour could shorten your life. Mourning in the palace wasn't really mourning, it was schedule. A eunuch would wake you up before sunrise, not because you had somewhere fun to go, but because your bowing posture needed rehearsal. Imagine starting every day practicing how to kneel without looking clumsy. Forget coffee, elegance was your caffeine. Breakfast wasn't a personal choice either. The kitchen prepared trays based on rank. Higher rank, more variety. Lower rank, more rice, less everything else. But careful, eating too much was frowned upon. Slim silhouettes were fashionable, so sometimes the best survival tip was pretending you weren't hungry while your stomach staged a protest march. The irony? They had feasts of imperial scale, yet many concubines went half-starved by choice, dieting for pale, fragile beauty. Somewhere in the palace archives, there's probably a note about someone who skipped dumplings for 3 months just to look ethereal, and you thought modern influencers invented detox culture. Dress code was another battlefield. Robes came in prescribed colours, each dye signalling rank. Accidentally wear a shade too close to the empress? Congratulations, you've committed fashion treason. The punishment wasn't just a scolding, it could be exile from favour. Imagine your entire career derailed because your tailor grabbed the wrong pigment, and those hairstyles, miles of combs, pins and elaborate buns. One slip, and suddenly your entire presentation looked sloppy. Some women literally needed assistance just to carry their hair ornaments. Yes, the head weighed like a small child. Forget Pilates, posture training here was survival. Perfume also mattered. Subtle scents were admired, but too strong, and you risked whispers about desperation. Picture it. A woman enters smelling slightly too floral, and half the courtyard decides she's doomed. This wasn't a beauty pageant. It was tactical warfare, fought with powder and rumours. Letters from family were rare, censored, and often delayed. Imagine waiting months for a message, only to receive 2 sentences. We are well. Stay obedient. That's it. No gossip, no warmth, just a reminder that your job was to behave. Visits were worse, families could only see you under strict supervision, like an awkward reality show with no privacy. The guards weren't just guarding you, they were guarding the empire's narrative. Nothing embarrassing must leak out. You weren't just a daughter anymore. You were property of the dynasty. Your family back home, they probably built a new roof, or bought extra land using the gifts tied to your position. Meanwhile, you're stuck counting tiles on the palace ceiling. That's the deal. Their freedom, your confinement. The social climate inside the concubine quarters could be summed up in one word. Surveillance. Everyone was watching everyone. If you dropped a chopstick, 3 women noticed. If you laughed too loudly, whispers began before you finished. Sometimes rivals didn't need evidence. A rumour was enough. She rolled her eyes at the empress. Boom, your career ended. The emperor didn't have time to verify every story. He relied on whispers and eunuchs. In a world where truth moves slower than gossip, your best defence was blandness. And yet, being too bland risked invisibility. If the emperor never noticed you, your existence might fade entirely. It was a bizarre paradox. Shine too bright and burn out. Shine too little and vanish. The middle path wasn't glamorous, but it kept you alive. Recreation existed, But even that came with strings. Music lessons, embroidery, maybe poetry if you had talent. But hobbies weren't just hobbies, they were weapons. Write a poem too clever, and others accused you of ambition. Embroider something too beautiful, and someone whispered you were trying to outshine higher ranks. Even your handwriting could betray you. The palace valued refined calligraphy, but if it looked too perfect, suspicion followed. Were you trying to signal intelligence? And if there's one thing dangerous in a harem of politics, it's looking smarter than people above you. So, hobbies were a balancing act. Be cultured, but not threatening. Be skilled, but not too skilled. Essentially, you were auditioning for survival 24/7. Then there was health, or the lack of it. Living inside sealed courtyards meant limited fresh air. Sunlight was avoided anyway, because pale skin was prized. Result: vitamin deficiency in an era before vitamins. Add stress, bad cosmetics, and risky childbirth, and the average concubine's health resembled a candle burning at both ends. And when illness struck? The palace had physicians, but access depended on rank. A favoured concubine got immediate care. Others? They might wait until the fever passed, or didn't. Imagine being told your sickness wasn't politically urgent enough for medicine. Childbirth was the ultimate gamble. A son could elevate your status overnight, but complications could kill you just as quickly. Medical knowledge wasn't advanced, and every delivery risked being your last. Some concubines prayed more to survive labour than to win favour. Let's pause for the most awkward reality. You weren't in charge of your own body. The emperor decided when you'd be summoned. Eunuchs documented it in ledgers. Yes, they literally kept a schedule. Some nights you were chosen, most nights not. And if you weren't chosen for too long, people noticed and assumptions followed. Imagine being discussed not for what you said or did, but for how many nights you appeared on the imperial calendar. It turned intimacy into statistics. Romantic? Not really. More like spreadsheet romance. So daily life was a strange cocktail. Structured routines, toxic beauty standards, family pressure, and constant competition. It looked glamorous from the outside, but from the inside, it felt like walking a tightrope blindfolded, with gossip acting as the wind. And here's the catch. Even if you survived the rules, the rumours, and the diets, there was no guarantee of reward. Some women lived decades inside those walls, without ever speaking more than a few words to the emperor. Their stories ended quietly, in obscurity. That's the reality of palace life. Luxury laced with poison, rituals stitched with fear, beauty wrapped in politics. Next time someone says they wish they lived like a princess, remember. In Ming China, the title came with surveillance, starvation, and suspicious eyeliner. Afternoons in the palace weren't for leisure. They were basically meetings with no agenda. You sat in the courtyard, staring at ponds, pretending it was meaningful. If you shifted too much, you looked restless. If you sat too still, you looked suspicious. Imagine being judged on your ability to impersonate a statue. Sunlight was avoided like a bad haircut. Pale skin was in fashion. So concubines lined up in the shade, like decorative jars. The fish in the pond had more freedom to move than you. Somewhere, a eunuch probably thought, fish doing fine. Concubine needs more whitening powder. Servants bustled around dusting robes that didn't need dusting. It wasn't cleaning, it was performance. If you sneezed, you were delicate. If you didn't sneeze, maybe you were too sturdy. Either way, someone made a note. Welcome to the Sneeze Olympics, where everyone loses. Tea practice filled entire afternoons. There was a correct way to pour, to sip, even to set the cup down. Tilt too far left? Vulgar. Too far right? Pretentious. The safe method was placing it like it was a fragile phone screen. Imagine losing social points over mug etiquette. Rest didn't escape the rules. Nap too long, lazy. Nap too short, anxious. Snore? Catastrophe. Some concubines even kept dream journals to report auspicious visions. Safest entry? dreamed nothing. It's the only dream that can't get you into trouble. The palace soundtrack was sandals on stone, silk rustling, eunuchs reciting schedules. Then silence. Long, heavy silence. And then gossip. Rumours were the palace version of social media. Fast, unreliable, addictive. A whisper like, "She bowed too shallow," could turn into, "She's plotting rebellion by dinner." Eunuchs were the moderators, deciding which post went viral. One favourite story was about a concubine sneezing during a ceremony. By the end of the day, it became, "She sneezed at the emperor." Her reputation dropped faster than a Wi-Fi connection during a movie stream. Meals looked impressive, but felt like performance art. Food was inspected for poison, then carefully arranged like props. Eating too quickly made you greedy. Too slowly made you fake. The safest strategy was synchronized chewing, like an accidental Olympic team. One concubine reportedly tucked dumplings into her sleeve to save for later. She got caught. The scandal wasn't the dumplings, it was the sauce stains on her robe. Apparently, soy sauce was the true enemy of elegance. Somewhere out there, a history book might be missing the headline, "Empire Shaken by Snack Smuggling." Evenings were like raffle nights. Eunuchs read names from a list. If yours was called, you won a surprise meeting with the emperor. If not, you embroidered another flower onto fabric you'd never wear. Some women waited years without hearing their names once. Imagine buying lottery tickets for decades and still ending up with nothing but thread. And the encounter, not romantic, bureaucratic. Your name was logged, time-stamped, results recorded. Intimacy became paperwork. If dating apps existed back then, the emperor's profile would read, "We'll see you when eunuchs schedule it." No rescheduling allowed. Nighttime wasn't restful either. Candles stayed lit, not for comfort, but to make sure no one wandered around. Darkness was suspicious, but light was uncomfortable. The compromise was everyone being equally annoyed. Weather joined the competition. Summers roasted you. Winters froze you. Silk robes looked elegant but worked like tissue paper against the elements. Complaining wasn't allowed, so you just smiled politely while sweating or shivering. The official palace motto could have been, "Uncomfortable but graceful." Even beds weren't private. Concubines often shared quarters, sometimes even beds. Snoring wasn't just annoying, it was political. If your roommate didn't like you, she might tell people you snored on purpose. Imagine filing a complaint to HR about bedtime noises, except HR is also your rival. And here's the kicker. Most days were boring, truly boring. Endless embroidery, tea drills, posture lessons. Then suddenly, chaos. Someone rumoured to have laughed too loud or bowed too short. The drama was unpredictable, but the boredom was guaranteed. That rhythm was exhausting. You couldn't relax because disaster might come from the tiniest detail. Weeks of routine, punctuated by one scandal that could erase you. Some concubines coped by laughing quietly, rolling their eyes when no one looked. Others perfected invisibility, blending so well they were practically palace wallpaper. Both strategies worked, sometimes, so that was palace life by afternoon and night. Not passion, not glamour, but survival through small performances. Drinking tea politely, chewing rice on tempo, and pretending dream journals mattered. The reward for succeeding today, getting to repeat the exact same thing tomorrow. And if anyone still thinks being a princess sounds magical, remember, some women were punished for sneezing. That's not Disney. That's endurance training with silk curtains. Mornings trained your bowing. Afternoons trained your tea. Evenings trained your patience. And nights trained your ability to pretend you were asleep, while wondering if tomorrow your hairstyle would still be legal. The palace wasn't a place to live in the modern sense. It was a 24/7 etiquette obstacle course. Imagine a reality show where every challenge is, don't move, don't talk, don't sneeze. And unlike modern reality shows, You couldn't vote yourself off. Let's review the big test of survival: invisibility. Shine too brightly, and rivals took you down. Shine too little, and no one remembered you existed. The goal was to hover in the middle, just noticeable enough to avoid dismissal, just quiet enough to avoid suspicion. Basically, palace life turned everyone into professional background characters. One of the biggest daily fears wasn't poison but paperwork. Eunuchs logged everything: who ate what, who slept where, who sneezed when. Imagine someone keeping a spreadsheet of your hiccups. The palace ran on records, not memories. The emperor might forget you, but the paperwork remembered forever. And those eunuchs, they were less like servants and more like gatekeepers to destiny. Want to send a note? Eunuch reads it first. Want to see the emperor? Eunuch decides if your request makes the list. Think of them as palace Wi-Fi routers. Everything passed through them, and sometimes the signal mysteriously dropped if someone else bribed them more. Let's not forget the competition. The palace wasn't a sorority. It was more like a crowded group project, where everyone wanted to be the leader, but no one admitted it. Alliances existed, but trust was rare. One day, you're sharing hairpins. The next, your friends whispering that your robe looked a little too ambitious. It wasn't always cruel, it was strategic. Everyone wanted security. And in a system where favour equaled survival, even a small rumour could tilt the balance. Think of it like a never-ending office politics game, except HR could exile you for the wrong eyebrow shape. Daily exercise, not push-ups, posture training. Your back had to be straight, your walk gliding, your hands folded just so. If modern gyms worked like this, trainers would yell, "Your sip angle is sloppy, hold that teacup tighter." Honestly, palace life was less cardio, more Pilates mixed with paranoia. Entertainment? Sure, there were music lessons, embroidery and poetry, but hobbies weren't fun, they were strategies. Play the zither beautifully, and you might impress. Play it too beautifully, and people accused you of showing off. Imagine getting in trouble for practicing guitar a little too well. And then, childbirth. It wasn't daily, but it loomed like the palace boss level. A son meant sudden power, but birth was risky without modern medicine. Many concubines faced life-threatening complications. It's like the world's most dangerous job perk. Maybe you win influence. Maybe you don't survive the process. Yet even motherhood didn't guarantee peace. A child could elevate you or paint a target on your back. Rivals might spread rumours. Eunuchs might twist details. And suddenly, your greatest strength became your weakness. It wasn't family planning. It was survival roulette. What about leaving the palace? Rare. Once inside, most women stayed for life. The exit strategy was either retirement at old age, marriage arranged elsewhere, or being quietly erased by history. The palace wasn't a hotel. You didn't check out with souvenirs. A few lucky ones did retire with honour. Others simply vanished from records. Their names never mentioned again. It's a reminder. The palace preserved the emperor's image, not yours. If history felt generous, it gave you a footnote. If not, you became palace wallpaper forever. Now here's the twist. Despite all the rules, the gossip, and the survival contests, many concubines never made the history books because nothing happened. No scandal, no drama, no rebellion, just quiet, repetitive living. And honestly, that's probably what survival looked like. You weren't aiming for glory. You were aiming for being unremarkable enough to live to old age. Imagine an entire life built on the motto, "Please forget me, but let me eat in peace." So let's wrap this daily tour. Being a Ming Dynasty concubine wasn't glittering gowns and moonlit gardens. It was endless etiquette rehearsals, gossip that spread faster than fire, dieting disguised as pale beauty, eunuchs acting as Wi-Fi moderators, and the constant fear that your sneeze might end your career. Luxury? Sure, by material standards. Freedom? None. Glamour? Only from a distance. So would you survive as a concubine? Honestly, maybe. If you can master synchronized chewing, stay perfectly bland, and never sneeze in public, you'd probably last longer than most. But for the rest of us, who occasionally slouch, snack too much, or laugh at the wrong moment, we'd be palace gossip by lunchtime. History books like to showcase the highlight reels. They love the concubine who rose from obscurity to empress, because palace fairy tale sells better than she sat in a courtyard for 40 years and perfected embroidery tension. But if we're being honest, the embroidery marathon was the default story. Climbing the ranks usually started with one golden ticket, having a son. Suddenly you weren't just a concubine, you were mother of a possible emperor. Big promotion, but also big stress, because palace parenting wasn't bedtime stories and lullabies. It was check the porridge for poison, then sing. Daycare mixed with espionage. And if your son became a favourite, congratulations, you just collected new enemies. Imagine modern parenting, but every toddler tantrum could be reported to rival factions. Your kid throws peas on the floor? That's not mess, that's political symbolism. On the other end of the spectrum were the forgotten ones. Women who lived entire lifetimes in the palace without seeing the emperor more than once. Picture applying for a job, getting one interview, and then waiting 40 years for the callback. Spoiler, they never called. Records barely mention them. They embroidered, attended rituals, drank tea, and that was it. Honestly, they were probably the lucky ones. The less attention you got, the less chance you sneezed your way into scandal. But the success stories, those few concubines who did climb, got immortalized. One woman might start as just another recruit in silk slippers, and somehow end up as empress. Sounds glamorous, right? Until you remember, being empress was just more stress with a bigger robe budget. You weren't escaping politics, you became the center of them. It was like finally winning the office promotion, only to realize now you're in charge of every meeting, every complaint, every crisis. Except instead of co-workers, you had rival clans. Family politics also shaped your fate. Concubines weren't just women, they were investments. If your family was in favour, great. If your uncle annoyed the wrong official, your career nosedived. Imagine being demoted at work because your cousin posted something unpopular on palace Twitter. Punishments weren't dramatic sword fights. They were quieter. Loss of rank, exile to smaller quarters, decades of time out. Basically, grounded for life. If you were lucky, you just ended up embroidering more curtains. Of course, the unlucky ones made headlines. A concubine accused of plotting. Another blamed for poisoning. Someone punished for laughing too loudly during ceremony. That last one isn't a joke, it's on record. Wrong pitch, wrong laugh, wrong decade of your life. But most didn't face dramatic endings. They just aged. The emperor grew older, new recruits entered, and yesterday's favourite became today's trivia question. Retirement wasn't announced, it just happened. The palace was like a streaming service, constantly replacing the old shows with new ones, no notifications. One concubine supposedly asked a eunuch after years of waiting, "Do you think His Majesty remembers me?" The eunuch replied, "He remembers everyone, on paper. Romance, but make it administrative." Another concubine prepared every night. Hair, makeup, perfect posture, waiting to be called. A decade passed, nothing. Finally, she gave up the ritual. Ironically, that's when her name was summoned. Apparently, the universe loves comedic timing. Then came the golden seat, Empress Dowager. The top job, but you only got there if your son became emperor. At that point, you weren't just surviving, you were running the palace. Ministers sought your approval, rivals avoided your disapproval, and your calendar filled with ceremonies. Powerful, yes, relaxing. Not at all. You traded being ignored for being blamed. So if we chart the biography of concubines, it's not a neat arc, it's a gamble. A handful won big, Many lost quietly, and most just stayed in the middle. The dividing line wasn't talent or romance, it was timing, politics, and luck. That's the real concubine career ladder. Embroidery, waiting, maybe one night with the emperor, and, if the stars aligned, a promotion into legend. Everyone else, footnotes, or not even that. So next time you see a painting of a regal empress, remember, behind her were hundreds of colleagues also perfecting their bows, sipping tea at regulation angles, and waiting for a name that never came. The biography of the few was built on the silence of the many. And that's palace history in a nutshell. Glamorous from far away, awkward up close. History tends to compress concubine life into two categories: tragic cautionary tale, or Cinderella with better curtains. Reality was much more like a group project that never ended. Most participants weren't stars or villains. They were just stuck in the middle, waiting for someone to update the spreadsheet. Being noticed by the emperor looked glamorous in paintings. In practice, it was like getting tagged by your boss on Slack. Everyone saw it, everyone had opinions, half the office immediately resented you. A single night could bring rewards, silks, jewellery, maybe a nicer chamber. But those rewards doubled as liabilities. Wear your new bracelet proudly, and people whispered you were arrogant. Hide it, and they whispered you were ungrateful. In the palace, jewellery wasn't fashion. It was evidence. The rotation of favourites was carefully, if somewhat mechanically, managed. Eunuchs kept schedules like bored HR managers. Your name might be called tonight, or not for 6 months. No explanation, no appeals process. Imagine your dating life managed entirely by Excel macros. And if the emperor's taste shifted, everyone scrambled. This month he liked poetry, so concubines crammed verses overnight. Next month it was hunting stories, and suddenly everyone had strong opinions about deer. Calligraphy, embroidery, music. The palace was basically an influencer economy centuries before TikTok. The algorithm was just one guy in dragon robes. Families outside the palace treated daughters as high-risk, high-reward investments. If you gained favour, your uncles suddenly had government jobs, your cousins better marriages, your parents new roofs. If you lost favour, all those perks evaporated. Pressure didn't arrive by letter. It was baked into every teacup you held. The emperor's moods were equally high stakes. A smile could make your month, a frown could ruin it. Some women rehearsed conversations like comedians practicing punchlines, hoping to land the perfect joke. Sometimes it worked. Sometimes the emperor sneezed and walked out, and years of planning evaporated thanks to seasonal pollen. Jealousy ran on its own schedule. Too many visits and murmurs spread. She monopolizes. She looks suspiciously healthy. She probably eats 2 dumplings. By the time these rumours completed their journey, dumplings had turned into a national security issue. Hovering above all of this was the empress. Officially, she kept order. Unofficially, she was referee, manager, and sometimes bouncer. One raised eyebrow could stall your entire career. Yet even she wasn't untouchable. Fail to produce an heir, and the palace quietly recategorized you as background decoration. Being empress wasn't immunity. It was just a bigger target. Punishments in this world weren't usually dramatic. Most were gradual erasures. A smaller room, fewer servants, exclusion from ceremonies, years of embroidery no one admired. The palace was excellent at making people invisible. Yes, sometimes things escalated. Exile to a side palace, forced isolation, very occasionally worse. But the standard penalty wasn't execution. It was paperwork. You disappeared not with a bang, but with a memo. So survival became a strange art. Too quiet, and you vanished. Too visible, and you attracted enemies. The sweet spot was polite, pleasant, and strategically forgettable. Some women mastered the art of permanent mild illness. Never too sick, never too well, always hovering in the middle. It sounds ridiculous, but it worked. Outliving rivals was its own kind of promotion. Others gambled on charm, like laughing enthusiastically at the emperor's jokes. That worked, until someone whispered the laugh sounded fake. In a system where dumplings were political, of course laughter had quarterly performance reviews. That's why most biographies don't read like fairy tales. They read like slow-burn workplace comedies. Promotions came from timing, politics, and luck, not talent alone. You might do everything right and still end up forgotten, or trip over your robe at the right moment and accidentally gain sympathy. The algorithm was chaos. Most names vanished not because they were boring, but because being boring was the safest way to survive. History records drama. The palace rewarded invisibility. From a distance, the system looked glamorous. Silk robes, candlelight, hairpins like miniature sculptures. Up close, it was gossip spreadsheets, risk management disguised as embroidery, and a calendar nobody understood. The concubine career wasn't a fairy tale ladder. It was more like a treadmill. Endless steps, little progress, occasional faint applause from the sidelines. So when history highlights the one concubine who became empress, remember, behind her were hundreds of colleagues perfecting the art of average. Their stories didn't vanish because they lacked drama. They vanished because their survival strategy was not being noticed at all. Palace life didn't pause in the evenings. If anything, that's when the real performance began. Daytime was embroidery and etiquette drills. Nighttime was about waiting to see if your name came up in what was basically the world's least romantic lottery. The system was simple. Eunuchs would announce which concubine had been chosen. Sounds efficient, except they sometimes carried the chosen woman to the emperor, wrapped in a quilt, like takeout delivery. Centuries later, historians argue about the details. But the point is, intimacy was bureaucratized. Nothing says romance like paperwork and a blanket. For women not picked, evenings meant small talk, tea, and passive-aggressive embroidery circles. Imagine a book club, where everyone is secretly trying to get the moderator fired. Conversations circled around harmless topics, weather, flowers, silk patterns, but every sentence doubled as surveillance. A compliment might hide a barb. A question about your health might be reconnaissance. Food played its own role in the politics. The palace kitchens were legendary, but your appetite was always on trial. Eat too much and whispers spread. Greedy, undisciplined. Eat too little and rumours swirled. Sickly, unfit. Some concubines perfected the 3-bite strategy. Just enough to look polite, never enough to be discussed. Imagine living in a world where dumpling etiquette could affect your career trajectory. The hierarchy never slept. Empress Dowager, Empress, high-ranking consorts, mid-tier consorts, low-tier consorts, attendants. Everyone knew exactly where they stood, and the wrong bow at the wrong angle could be interpreted as rebellion. Posture was politics. Even walking was competitive. Who walked in front of whom, how quickly, how gracefully, every detail mattered. You weren't just strolling down a corridor. You were filing an application for relevance. Gossip was the unofficial palace currency. Information travelled faster than tea cooled. Did you hear she sneezed during morning ritual? Her hairpin tilted left at dinner. Small details snowballed into full-blown narratives. The palace was a rumour factory, with 24/7 production. Some women tried to opt out, keeping to themselves. But that strategy backfired too. Silence was suspicious. If you weren't gossiping, people assumed you were plotting. So you had to gossip just enough to seem normal, but not enough to become memorable. Basically, palace life was the world's first social media feed. Scroll, comment, like, but carefully. Nights could be long, and boredom was dangerous. Too much free time led to speculation, and speculation led to factions. A casual remark could spiral into evidence of conspiracy. One story tells of a concubine who casually mentioned the emperor's handwriting looked tired. Within a week, She was accused of criticizing imperial vigor. That's the palace version of subtweeting, gone wrong. And of course, illness hovered in the background. Stress, confined quarters, questionable cosmetics, health was fragile. But sickness itself was politicized. Too sick, and you risked irrelevance. Not sick enough, and rivals accused you of faking, for sympathy. Even coughing had performance metrics. Pregnancy was the ultimate high-stakes event. Carrying the emperor's child could elevate your rank, secure your family's future, and grant near-empress authority if the child became heir. But it was also dangerous. Medical knowledge was limited, and childbirth complications were common. Rival concubines sometimes treated a pregnancy not as good news, but as a threat to their own survival. A single child could tilt the balance of the entire empire. Imagine one infant becoming the pivot of careers, fortunes, and international diplomacy. Suddenly your morning sickness was a matter of state, but most nights nothing dramatic happened. Concubines waited, some embroidered, some tuned instruments, some stared at the ceiling, and wondered if they'd ever be mentioned in a chronicle. The majority weren't. Their lives didn't end with scandal or triumph. They just ended. That's the unglamorous reality. Palace life was less epic drama and more open-plan office with stricter dress code. Most people weren't plotting coups. They were quietly trying to avoid tripping over their robes. Yet within this monotony, the stakes were enormous. Every bow, every dumpling, every giggle could be career-defining. It was survival by 1,000 micro-decisions. Too often, history only remembers the extremes, the empresses who ruled, the concubines who met violent ends. But the majority lived in the grey space, not tragic, not legendary, just tense, careful, ordinary. And that ordinary, embroidered, whispered, surveilled, was the daily rhythm of palace nights. By now, you've probably noticed that concubine survival wasn't about beauty alone. It was about balance, timing, and not sneezing in the wrong direction. Batch 4 is where we look at the fine print, the health hazards, the beauty routines, the risks that made palace life less luxury spa and more reality show with medical disclaimers. Start with beauty standards. The palace demanded pale skin, long hair, slim build. Natural genetics? Optional. Shortcuts? Absolutely. Women slathered on whitening pastes that often contained lead or mercury. Yes, the same ingredients we now use for horror stories on YouTube chemistry channels. If your skin looked smooth, you gained points. If your skin turned grey, well, technically still pale, but not the right kind. Hair care was its own battlefield. Long, glossy hair symbolised vitality. Concubines used oils, herbs, sometimes questionable brews passed down by ambitious relatives. One recipe involved boiling walnut shells. Another used extracts that smelled suspiciously like a pharmacy exploded. No one cared. As long as your hair shimmered under candlelight, diet was equally unforgiving. Staying slim mattered, but meals were group events under constant observation. The safest strategy remained the famous 3-bite method: a little rice, a little vegetable, a polite smile, and push the bowl away. Eating more was dangerous. Eating less looked weak. A concubine's stomach wasn't her own. It was a stage. Exercise existed, though nobody called it that. Dancing, practicing posture, moving through ceremonies. It was all cardio disguised as culture. Hours of standing perfectly still counted as endurance training. If you've ever been in a wedding photo lineup that lasted too long, multiply that by decades. Stress was the silent killer. Living in a confined palace, constantly monitored, constantly compared, meant nerves never rested. Some women developed chronic illnesses. Others lived in a state of permanent, mild cold. It wasn't glamorous. It was exhausting. Pregnancy carried the highest risks of all. On paper, it was the ultimate promotion. A healthy son could secure your place in history. In practice, childbirth was dangerous. Medical knowledge was limited, infections common, mortality rates high. The palace celebrated births, but funerals often followed quietly. And let's not forget punishments. Concubines could face physical discipline, isolation, or forced demotions. Sometimes punishment meant exile to a remote palace, which sounds peaceful, until you realize remote also meant forgotten forever. It wasn't dramatic execution most of the time. It was bureaucratic disappearance. Health risks were matched by psychological risks. Imagine a world where your best friends might also be reporting on you, where your letters home were censored, where even humming the wrong tune could be interpreted as coded criticism. Privacy was non-existent. Some women coped by journaling, except their journals were sometimes confiscated too. The combination of cosmetics, stress, diet, childbirth, and politics created short lifespans. Few concubines lived long, and fewer still left full records of their lives. That's why most names blur in chronicles. Only the dramatic or politically useful were remembered. Everyone else disappeared into the palace wallpaper. And that's the irony. The palace produced endless luxury, but its residents rarely lived long enough to enjoy it. Perfumed chambers, silk cushions, fine teas, these comforts were real, but so were the migraines, the skin rashes, the pregnancies that ended badly. The palace was less like a paradise and more like an over-decorated pressure cooker. Yet people still wanted in. Families still offered daughters, rulers from tributary states still sent women as tokens of loyalty. Why? Because the potential payoff was immense. If your daughter became empress, your entire clan's fortunes rose. The risk was high, but so was the jackpot. It was basically the imperial version of buying lottery tickets, except the lottery involved memorizing poetry, balancing dumplings, and avoiding mercury poisoning. The saddest truth is that many concubines didn't even get a dramatic downfall. They just faded, too sick to compete, too cautious to be remembered, too unlucky to catch the emperor's attention. Their names dropped out of the record, their portraits lost, their graves unmarked. Survival often meant becoming invisible, and invisibility meant history forgot you. But forgetting was safer than being remembered for the wrong reason. A concubine who died in childbirth was tragic. A concubine accused of plotting was infamous. A concubine who lived quietly into her 40s, embroidering flowers no one admired, safe, obscure, but safe. So when we think about palace life, it's tempting to picture candlelight, embroidered sleeves, whispered poems in moonlit gardens. In reality, concubines were constantly calculating. 3 bites, not 4, smile, but not too big, powder, but not too thick. Luxury existed, yes, but it was padded with anxiety, illness, and risks as sharp as any battlefield. And that's why historians sometimes say palace life was more dangerous than war. On the battlefield, at least you knew who your enemies were. In the palace, the enemy might be your mirror, your neighbour, or the paste you just applied to your face. History books like to give us certainty. Dates, names, neat timelines. The Ming Palace gives us the opposite. It's a place where the most important archive sometimes reads like gossip notes, written by someone who clearly had a favourite character. If you're looking for clear facts, you'll find more fog than clarity. Fog carefully managed by eunuchs, with excellent job security. Eunuchs weren't just attendants, they were the palace's ultimate editors. A visitor might think they were carrying trays or opening doors. In reality, they were managing the information economy of the entire empire. One decided who got 5 minutes with the emperor. Another decided which rumour travelled down the corridor. If a concubine sneezed in the wrong direction, a eunuch could decide whether it was reported as hay fever or political rebellion. That's the tricky part when historians try to reconstruct events. The archives we have are like stage scripts written after the performance, and the scriptwriters loved drama. Concubine A gives concubine B a sharp look. Suddenly it's described as a deadly rivalry that threatened the harmony of the realm. Meanwhile, concubine C, who minded her own business for 30 years, got no footnote at all. Turns out history isn't fair, it's just heavily edited reality television. The bias is obvious once you notice it. A woman who was favoured by the emperor was praised as virtuous, elegant, noble. If she lost favour, the same notes flipped: jealous, manipulative, unstable. It's less about personality and more about who was winning that week. Imagine being reviewed in real time, except the reviewers were your enemies, and the review score determined whether you lived in comfort or house arrest. Archaeology tries to cut through the bias, but objects can only whisper so much. A porcelain bowl survives, but not the complaint about how bland the rice was. A comb survives, but not the sigh of someone pulling tangles out of her hair while dreading another ceremony. When museums display a lacquered box and label it symbol of refinement, you can almost hear the ghost of its owner saying, "Actually, it was where I kept snacks away from nosy roommates." Still, those fragments matter. They prove that most women weren't orchestrating plots, they were just living. Medicine jars hint at chronic illnesses, repaired trinkets show thriftiness. These aren't the stories that make it into official annals, but they're the evidence of ordinary survival strategies inside an extraordinary cage. Then there are the rumours, palace life's most renewable resource. A concubine might hum a tune in the garden, and within days someone swore it was a coded insult aimed at the emperor. Another might stumble on a rug, and by evening someone had declared it an omen of political instability. Palace corridors were basically rumour amplifiers. By the time a story made it back to the emperor, it had mutated beyond recognition. She sneezed became she cursed your ancestors. Try defending yourself against that. The eunuchs managed this ecosystem like gardeners pruning vines. They decided which gossip was harmless and which should bloom into a scandal. It gave them quiet power, no sword, no crown, just a well-timed whisper. And once something hit the official archive, it fossilized into fact. Even if it started as a joke, muttered over tea. That's the mystery modern readers inherit. We don't know how many of these stories were true, and we probably never will. We can dig up artifacts, translate scrolls, analyze paintings, but the tone, the laughter, the eye rolls, the sighs, that's gone. What remains are official reports that make palace life sound like a non-stop soap opera, when in reality, most days were probably crushingly ordinary. Ordinary doesn't survive the editing process. It's the scandal that gets ink. The quiet women vanish, while the dramatic ones become legends. That's why we know the names of a handful of concubines, but not the hundreds who shared their world. Their existence is the great missing chapter of Ming history, and the palace wanted it that way. Mystery wasn't an accident, it was a design feature. The walls weren't just physical, they were narrative walls too. Outsiders saw grandeur and secrecy and assumed greatness. Insiders lived routine and stress, but the routine never left the gates. If you were forgotten, that was the point. So when tourists today walk through the Forbidden City, they see painted beams, giant courtyards, golden tiles. What they don't see are the lives erased by silence. They see the curated highlight reel, not the full story. And maybe that's why the place still feels heavy with mystery. Not because ghosts haunt it, but because the ordinary people who once filled it never had their stories told. History loved to note when the emperor sneezed, but the women who dressed him, they slipped out of the record entirely. That's less a riddle, more a very bad joke. If you picture palace records as neat scrolls with absolute truth, adjust your expectations. Think less encyclopedia and more comment section. Notes about the women of the palace were rarely neutral. They were scribbled by people with agendas, moods, or simply a need to keep their supervisors entertained. A concubine smiled too brightly during a banquet. The archive might label her overly ambitious. Another failed to laugh at a poem. Cold and disrespectful. Personality traits weren't observed, they were assigned. and once assigned, they stuck like ink stains on silk. That's why the records read like a series of plot twists. 1 month, Lady X was dignified, a model of virtue. 6 months later, after losing favour, she was jealous, hysterical, disruptive. Did her personality really transform overnight? Or did her reviewers simply switch sides? The palace archive was less a mirror of reality and more a scoreboard. Eunuchs had a hand in this, of course. They were the original curators. If the emperor wanted updates, they decided which details to include. A stomachache could be described as momentary discomfort or sign of cosmic imbalance, depending on whether they wanted sympathy or suspicion stirred. They weren't lying exactly, they were spinning. And spin was currency. The mystery for historians is separating spin from substance. How many of the palace scandals were genuine, and how many were just overblown footnotes? Was the famous poisoned dumpling incident a real assassination attempt, or simply food poisoning on a humid day? With no neutral witnesses, we're left piecing together half-truths. And archaeology, helpful as it is, doesn't provide subtitles. A bronze mirror can tell us what someone looked at, but not what they thought when they saw themselves. A jade hairpin can tell us style, but not the whispered insult it sparked. Physical remains confirm wealth, not whispers. The missing voices are the most obvious gap. Very few concubines left their own writings. Some tried, but their letters were intercepted or edited before survival. Diaries were rare, and the ones that exist often sound suspiciously polished, as if written under supervision. Imagine trying to keep a journal at work while your boss constantly edits your entries. Today I was sad becomes, today I joyfully upheld palace order. The result? Silence. Hundreds of women, erased not because they did nothing, but because they did nothing scandalous. And silence is hard to interpret. Historians crave events, archives crave drama. If you lived quietly, you became invisible. But invisibility leaves traces in odd ways. Take medicine jars. Excavations reveal concubines weren't paragons of perfect health. They dealt with chronic pain, stomach trouble, insomnia. Powdered cosmetics with mercury caused skin issues. Yet these details rarely made the records. Why? Because sickness didn't fit the preferred narrative of elegance and control. The archive preferred to tell us about one flamboyant quarrel, rather than 100 women with headaches. The same goes for punishment. We read dramatic cases of exile or execution, but not the countless women who endured smaller humiliations, being relocated to a less favourable chamber, losing attendance, being excluded from ceremonies. Ordinary penalties didn't sound grand enough to record. Yet for the women themselves, they were daily realities. The palace built its own mystery by design. Walls weren't just to protect, they were to control narrative. Outsiders saw grandeur and assumed perfection. Insiders lived the grind and couldn't record it. The only voices that survived were the loudest, and usually the most politically useful. That's why the palace reads today like an incomplete puzzle. We see a corner piece, working scandal, a shiny middle piece, luxury. But most of the plain edges, ordinary living, are missing. If life were a painting, we're staring at the bold strokes, while the background has faded away. So, what do we really know? We know eunuchs edited everything. We know archives exaggerated. We know artifacts confirm daily life, but not feelings. We know silence swallowed the majority. That's not a failure of history, it's the system working exactly as planned. The mystery of the Ming concubines isn't whether they were scheming every day. The real mystery is how many lived quietly, laughed at the wrong joke once, endured endless rituals, and then vanished from the record as if they had never existed. And maybe that's the sharpest truth archaeology gives us. Beneath the jewels and palaces, these weren't characters in a drama. They were people, navigating an environment designed to turn ordinary lives invisible. Mystery in the Ming Palace didn't arrive in the form of hidden treasure or secret tunnels. It arrived in the form of paperwork. And not even the fun kind. Palace records written by clerks who seemed to enjoy dramatic adjectives a little too much. If you ever wonder why history sounds like everyone was either scheming or sobbing, it's because the people holding the pens didn't believe in average. One concubine faints during a hot afternoon. The note reads, "Suspicious collapse, omen of instability." Another laughs a second too late at a joke, mockery of imperial dignity. If someone had sneezed twice in succession, odds are a eunuch would have filed it under possible sorcery. That's the mystery. We don't know what was real, what was exaggeration, and what was just someone padding their report to impress a superior. This is why reading the Ming archives feels less like history and more like scrolling through a gossip tabloid. Everyone is painted either angelic or monstrous, depending on their luck that season. No shades of grey, just all or nothing reputations. The truth, likely that most women were just trying to stay out of trouble, didn't make the cut. Quiet people don't sell stories. Archaeologists, bless them, dig for the quieter truths. They find chipped bowls, reused pins, patches on silk. These items whisper, life was repetitive, frugal, sometimes stressful, but that whisper competes with the shouting in the official records. If you compare the two, it's like one person calmly describing a Tuesday, while another is insisting the world ended at lunch. The eunuchs made sure the shouting got heard. Their job description said, attendant, but in practice, they were the palace's news editors. If a story made the emperor chuckle, they leaned into it. If a detail risked boring him, they cut it. Imagine if your entire reputation depended on a man with scissors deciding which sentence survived. Of course, eunuchs also had factions. Supporting one concubine's clan meant shading the rival clan's women in unflattering light. That's how Lady Z showed admirable restraint could appear in one scroll, while another described the same event as Lady Z failed to contribute, clearly resentful. Which is correct? Neither, probably. But once written down, it became history. This leaves modern readers in a strange position. We know more about palace drama than palace laundry. We know who supposedly poisoned whom, but not who mended slippers. We know which concubine allegedly cursed the emperor with a glare, but not which one figured out the best way to stop hairpins from slipping. Everyday genius went undocumented, while rumours enjoyed the spotlight. And that's the puzzle. Archaeology fills gaps with objects, but objects can't tell tone. A cup can't explain whether tea was shared in friendship or gulped nervously in silence. A hair ornament can't tell us if it was worn with pride or just because regulations demanded it. We can catalogue artifacts, but feelings, gone. That's why the palace remains mysterious, not because it was unknowable, but because it was carefully curated to seem unknowable. The mystery itself was part of the brand. High walls, strict gates, selective archives, it all worked together to produce a story where the emperor shone and everyone else blurred. So what survives? Legends of women who rose meteorically or fell catastrophically. A handful of names attached to scandals. And silence for the majority. Silence that isn't accidental, but structured. The mystery of the palace is that most of its people were designed to vanish, as if survival without drama was the ultimate invisibility cloak. And here's the kicker. When tourists walk the Forbidden City today, they marvel at its grandeur. They photograph thrones, courtyards, golden tiles. Rarely do they pause at the smaller chambers, the places where the ordinary women lived out entire decades unseen. If walls could talk, they'd probably say, yes, it was pretty. No, it wasn't exciting every day. And please stop ignoring the side rooms. That's the irony of palace mystery. What lingers is the curated illusion of non-stop drama. What's lost are the routines, the small frustrations, the little victories. We remember the soap opera, we forget the sitcom, and yet the sitcom probably made up 90% of daily life. So when historians ask, what was it really like to be a concubine? The answer is more boring and more stressful than the archives will ever admit. Mystery isn't just about what we don't know. It's also about what the palace refused to let us know. The biggest mystery about the Ming Palace isn't hidden tunnels or secret chambers. It's why so much of it reads like the world's most biased yearbook. If you were in favour, the captions under your portrait were glowing. If you slipped out of favour, suddenly you were the villain in everyone's story. Same person, different chapter, completely different reputation. Eunuchs were the yearbook committee. They chose which photos made it in, which captions stuck, and who mysteriously didn't appear at all. If you weren't photogenic in a political sense, you were cropped out. That's how hundreds of concubines, real people with decades of daily life, disappeared without a trace. The records we do have tilt towards spectacle. An argument over seating order gets inflated into unprecedented turmoil. A fainting spell becomes evidence of divine displeasure. At some point, you wonder if the clerks were competing for Most Dramatic Description award. For all we know, palace life involved a lot more waiting around than plotting. But waiting around didn't make it into the scrolls. Archaeology tries to bring balance. Broken fans, patched robes, worn sandals, these hint at routines. They say, people lived here long enough to need repairs, not just glory. Yet objects can't roll their eyes, can't whisper jokes, can't tell us if someone got through ceremonies by counting tiles on the ceiling. Artifacts survive, emotions evaporate, and that evaporation is the core of the mystery. Imagine a palace with thousands of conversations a day, complaints about drafty rooms, gossip about fashion, strategies for not tripping on long sleeves. Almost none of it was recorded. Instead, we got a handful of scandals, polished into lessons, everything else dissolved. The silence wasn't an accident. It was how the palace managed its own reputation. That's why historians are stuck juggling contradictions. The scrolls say the palace was a battlefield of jealous rivals. The artifacts suggest it was also a workplace of chores, illnesses, and monotony. Which version is true? Both and neither. The drama was real for some, but routine defined the majority. Mystery grows in the gap between what was written down and what was lived. Even the punishments reflect this bias. We hear about exiles, forced suicides, dramatic downfalls. What we don't read about, the countless women downgraded quietly, moved to smaller quarters, denied little privileges. Those punishments didn't sound epic, but they probably cut deeper day to day. Losing your position in the seating charts won't fill a chronicle, but it might ruin your life. Eunuchs, again, decided which version went up the chain. They were the narrators who knew the emperor only had patience for highlights. So they gave him highlights, scandals, omens, rivalries. The same way modern news prefers explosions over reports about recycling. Attention was the real currency, and they were in charge of minting it. For tourists today, the mystery feels tangible. Walk through the Forbidden City and you see grandeur everywhere. Courtyards, painted beams, golden roofs, but the smaller, quieter chambers tell the real story. Not the scandalous one, the forgotten one. Rooms where dozens of women lived out decades, none of which survived in writing. You're standing in history's blind spot, and maybe that's the strangest mystery. How effective the palace was at erasing ordinariness. Drama survived because it was useful. Silence swallowed the rest. It leaves us with a world where concubines either glow in legend or vanish in dust, with almost nothing in between. So when someone asks, what secrets still hide in the palace? The answer isn't a hidden scroll or a buried treasure. The answer is the missing lives of hundreds of people who are too normal to be remembered. The palace walls kept them in physically. The archives kept them out historically, and the result is the polished illusion we still puzzle over today. That's the final twist of the Ming mystery. It's not about what's locked away, it's about what was never written down. If you ever want to see how bizarre human priorities can get, look at how the Ming court treated concubines. Officially, they were symbols of refinement, elegance, and national prestige. Unofficially, they were people. People who sneezed, tripped on stairs, got annoyed at their neighbours, and worried about wrinkles. But you wouldn't know that from the way the court talked about them. The palace treated women as a kind of political currency. A concubine wasn't just a wife or companion. She could be a diplomatic gift, an alliance marker, or proof that the empire had taste. Korea sends tribute. Here come the palace notes, slotting women into categories like they were exotic imports. Families jockeyed for position because one daughter in the palace meant influence. Suddenly, a teenager became not just a daughter, but an entire clan's investment strategy. And yet for all this pomp, most concubines ended up fading out quietly. A lucky few rose to empress or dowager status. Others were remembered because they fell spectacularly. Exile, punishment, sometimes execution. But the majority? They aged out of favour, moved into quieter quarters, and eventually passed away without anyone noting more than their burial expenses. That's the strange contrast. Public symbols, private invisibility. To the empire, concubines were glittering ornaments of state. To history, most became question marks. The spotlight was blinding while it lasted, but the fade-out was swift. It's almost comical, how the system sold grandeur while delivering monotony. An outsider might imagine endless banquets, silken robes, whispered romances. The reality? Endless rules, regulated diets, boring ceremonies, and a daily fight against the drafty climate of Beijing. You could be an official jewel of the empire and still spend an afternoon worrying about chilblains. The palace loved contrast. On paper, concubines embodied harmony. In practice, they embodied stress. A woman elevated as a treasure of the realm could find herself scolded by an attendant for holding her chopsticks wrong. Imagine being a national symbol, but still getting corrected on table manners. Families back home rarely saw the backstage mess. To them, having a daughter in the palace was a victory. Influence, status, prestige. But they weren't the ones navigating rivalries over seating charts. They weren't the ones wondering if a casual yawn during a lecture might be interpreted as treason. The gap between external perception and internal reality was wide enough to drive a caravan through. And then came retirement, or what passed for it. The official euphemism was being honoured with rest. Translation: moving to smaller quarters, often with fewer attendants, sometimes with restrictions on movement. Some women did leave with stipends, or were allowed to marry lower officials. But more often, retirement meant vanishing into obscurity, living out quiet years until death. It's this vanishing act that highlights the sharpest contrast. For decades, concubines were harem jewels, then suddenly they weren't. No headlines, no public mourning, no statues, just silence. It's hard to think of another role in history where someone could go from symbol of the state to total invisibility so quickly. Historians try to reconstruct the social logic behind this, but it comes down to the simple fact: concubines weren't people in the eyes of the system. They were positions. And once a position wasn't needed, the individual behind it blurred out. Tourists today often marvel at the extravagance. The red walls, golden roofs, vast courtyards. It's easy to forget that those same spaces were filled with people whose lives ended in obscurity. The grandeur was permanent. The individuals were temporary. That's the social equation of the palace: timeless architecture, disposable lives. And maybe that's why the contrast hits so hard. You can walk through the Forbidden City now, camera in hand, and feel overwhelmed by scale. But behind those same walls, hundreds of women once felt underwhelmed by reality. They were told they were at the center of the universe, yet many spent their final years sidelined, their names quietly erased. So the lesson of the palace isn't just about power or beauty, it's about how prestige can vanish, faster than steam off a rice bowl. For concubines, being Hata Nagara didn't guarantee memory. It guaranteed pressure, and more often than not, it guaranteed disappearance. That's the real social mystery of the Ming harem, how lives so public in image could be so private in fate. From a distance, the imperial harem looked like the crown jewel of Ming society. Families whispered about it like it was the most exclusive club in town. Officials bragged when their niece was selected, as though she had just gotten into the best university. Except the tuition was your freedom, and the degree was endless etiquette lessons. A concubine wasn't just a daughter anymore. She became her clan's investment portfolio. Imagine a father back in the countryside, polishing his rice bowl with pride. Yes, my daughter now represents the prosperity of our lineage. Meanwhile, his daughter was stuck in the capital, practicing how to bow at 15 different angles, trying to avoid sneezing at the wrong time. Prestige glowed brightly, but it didn't last. For every woman who became empress or dowager, dozens more drifted into obscurity. The palace system was like a funnel, wide at the entrance, narrow at the top. Lots entered, few rose, most got stuck somewhere in the middle, forever balancing ritual, gossip, and the slow tick of the palace calendar. The palace didn't hide its view of these women as property. Official scrolls literally described them as treasures of the realm. That sounds flattering, until you realise it meant being appraised, catalogued and ranked, like fine ceramics, except the porcelain didn't have to endure foot-binding shoes or mandatory dance rehearsals in winter. The illusion of grandeur was carefully staged. On festival days, concubines paraded in silk, perfectly arranged like jewels on display. To visitors, it was elegance incarnate. To the women, it was hours of prep, stiff postures, and sore backs from elaborate hairpieces. You looked graceful for 10 minutes, then collapsed in private while a maid tried to unpin 30 hair ornaments. Daily life was less glamorous. Meals were timed, conversations monitored, schedules packed with rituals that nobody outside the palace cared about. But on paper, each concubine symbolized harmony and refinement. It's a little like reading a brochure that says luxury retreat, when the guests know it's actually boot camp. Families back home only saw the brochure. To them, having a daughter in the harem meant prestige, alliances, opportunity. They weren't the ones stuck dealing with rivalries over seating arrangements, or panicking because they accidentally wore the wrong shade of silk on the wrong day. The gap between perception and reality could fit an entire palace courtyard. Exits from the harem reflected the same contradiction. Records spoke of women honoured with rest or graciously retired. In practice, it could mean a stipend and a move to smaller quarters, or simply being ignored until death. The elegant phrases in the archives disguised the plain fact. You were no longer needed, and the palace preferred that you faded quietly. That fading was brutal in its efficiency. A woman could be described 1 year as a jewel of virtue, and 5 years later not be mentioned at all. If you were lucky, you got a burial recorded in the financial logs. If not, your life became invisible, your name a ghost between ledger lines. For people supposedly representing the empire's glory, that's a sharp drop. And punishments? Same story. The dramatic cases, exile, forced death, made the chronicles. The quieter ones didn't. Being downgraded to smaller rooms, losing attendance, or being left out of ceremonies wasn't glamorous enough to record. Yet those minor penalties shaped everyday survival. Imagine going from 10 servants to 2, from a spacious hall to a cramped chamber. That stung far more than a chronicler's silence acknowledged. From a social perspective, the harem was a stage. The empire projected glitter and harmony, while the women inside managed boredom, illness, and rivalries. Outsiders saw spectacle, insiders saw chores. That tension is why historians struggle. We have the highlight reel, not the full show. And the highlight reel only remembered winners and scandals. If you became empress, you got chapters. If you died dramatically, you got cautionary tales. If you lived quietly for 40 years, silence. No one wrote down your preferred tea or your favourite embroidery pattern. Prestige erased individuality as thoroughly as obscurity did. Tourists walking the Forbidden City today feel the grandeur instantly. Vast courtyards, golden roofs, endless halls. But the women who filled those halls, most were erased so cleanly that even their laughter left no echo. The palace walls outlasted them. The titles they once carried dissolved. Grand architecture permanent, human lives disposable. That's the social math of the Ming harem, and maybe that's why the story still stings. It wasn't that the women were irrelevant, it was that they were only relevant as long as they fit the palace script. Once their role expired, the palace didn't bother to preserve their names. Imagine being treated as a national symbol, only to vanish like a misplaced receipt. That's the lasting paradox. Concubines represented the empire at its most refined, yet most ended in obscurity. Prestige without permanence, glory without memory. Their lives remind us how societies can turn people into symbols, and then quietly forget them once the symbol is no longer needed. If you judged the Ming harem by how officials described it, you'd think it was a cross between a museum of fine art and the Olympics. Look at these jewels of the nation, they proclaimed, as though concubines were artifacts to admire. But daily life inside felt less like a gallery and more like a workplace where the uniforms were expensive and the coffee breaks non-existent. For families back home, sending a daughter into the palace was like winning a golden lottery ticket. They imagined influence, glory, and maybe even future grandchildren with imperial eyebrows. In reality, their daughter's prize was memorizing 37 different ways to bow, waiting for eunuchs to unlock doors, and trying to smile convincingly while wearing headpieces heavy enough to cause mild whiplash. Concubines weren't just individuals, they were national brand ambassadors. Diplomats saw them lined up like a living brochure for Ming prestige. Neighbouring states even contributed women as tribute. Nothing says international relations quite like sending your cousin away forever. So another empire can claim harmony. The paperwork called it diplomacy. The concubines probably called it moving day, with no return trip. Inside the walls, life turned into an endless loop of contrast. Public ceremonies projected refinement. Silks, music, precise choreography. Private reality, aching backs, boredom, and the occasional wardrobe malfunction when sleeves dipped into soup bowls. It's hard to maintain the aura of national treasure when your main challenge is surviving the weight of a 12-layer robe. The empire loved to describe the harem as harmonious. Records gushed about dignity and balance. Anyone who's worked in a crowded office knows what that really means. Unending gossip, low-key rivalries, and at least one person hoarding extra snacks under the desk. Harmony, in palace speak, was code for "we hope nobody notices the arguments in the hallway." Punishments reinforced the charade. Major scandals, yes, those filled the scrolls. A concubine exiled, executed, or publicly disgraced. Perfect moral lesson. But smaller humiliations, losing attendance, being demoted to smaller chambers, running out of candles, and never made it into the archives. Yet those minor penalties shaped daily life more than dramatic endings did. Imagine being labelled a jewel of the empire one week and rationed on firewood the next. That's the cruelest contrast. Celebrated in public, sidelined in private. One woman could be called the embodiment of elegance at a festival, only to spend the evening with aching feet and a robe that smelled faintly of damp storage. Another might be praised as a radiant example of loyalty, while quietly dreading the draft sneaking through her paper windows. Prestige looked glamorous. Survival looked uncomfortable. Families rarely learned this. Letters were censored, visits restricted, gossip filtered. To the outside world, their daughter was living among silk and ceremony. To the woman herself, she was learning which corridors were warmest in winter, and which eunuchs were most likely to forget to deliver dessert. Prestige was a family's dream. Routine was the concubine's reality. Retirement carried the same contradictions. Archives said women were granted repose or honoured with rest. Reality often meant smaller rooms, fewer attendants, and the slow fade of irrelevance. If you were lucky, you left with a stipend or a minor marriage arrangement. If not, you lingered quietly until your name dissolved into the palace silence. The silence is striking. A woman could be described one year as a treasure of the dynasty, and the next year disappear entirely from records. No scandal, no farewell, not even a receipt for funeral costs. She had been transformed into a position, and once that position wasn't needed, the person vanished. Tourists today admire the Forbidden City's red walls and golden tiles. It's easy to believe the propaganda that every corner glowed with refinement. But behind those walls, hundreds of women lived out decades unnoticed, their frustrations and laughter erased. The architecture endured. Their names didn't. The contrast between stone permanence and human disposability is the real ghost of the palace. Even more ironic, concubines symbolized collective strength, while individually disposable. The empire showed them off like trophies. Yet the women themselves spent more time balancing ceremonies, rules, and sore shoulders than basking in glory. The more the state celebrated them as ideals, the less space they had to exist as individuals. And that's the social comedy of the harem. It pretended to be glamorous, but mostly it was a machine that turned women into symbols, and then quietly retired those symbols once the shine wore off. Prestige without permanence, status without memory. The system loved the illusion of harmony, but erased the people who had to live it. So the contrast lives on. Concubines were treated as priceless while present, forgotten once absent, grand in ceremony, invisible in history. That's not just irony, it's the cruel joke history left behind. The Ming Palace loved labels. Concubines weren't just women. They were gems of harmony, treasures of the dynasty, and sometimes even Harta Nagara. Imagine being introduced at a dinner party that way. This is Aunt Lee, our national asset. She also makes great dumplings. The titles sounded impressive, but living under them was another story. The women themselves rarely had time to enjoy the grandeur. Between ceremonies, etiquette drills, and wardrobe changes, being a treasure felt suspiciously like unpaid labour. You got prestige, yes, but it came with strict curfews, surveillance, and a wardrobe budget controlled entirely by eunuchs who didn't wear the clothes themselves. Families loved to brag, though. "My daughter is now in the palace," they announced, as if she had landed the empire's top internship. Never mind that the internship involved strict diets, possible exile, and the occasional risk of execution. From a distance, the harem looked like a golden ticket. Up close, it looked like bureaucracy in silk. And the bureaucracy was relentless. Eating schedules, seating charts, bed assignments, all regulated. Concubines could be paraded before diplomats as symbols of refinement, then scolded that same night for stepping 3 inches out of line during rehearsal. Nothing like being a national treasure and also getting written up for robe management errors. Diplomatically, concubines were props in empire theatre. Korea and Southeast Asia sometimes sent women as tribute, as if gifting actual humans was just another way of saying, "Thanks for not invading this year." For the receiving empire, it was a flex. "Behold, Even our allies supply us with concubines. For the women, it was a one-way ticket to a palace where your biggest diplomatic role was surviving the hair ornaments. The contrast was wild. In official reports, concubines embodied cultural perfection. In private life, they fought colds, swapped gossip, and probably rolled their eyes when court musicians repeated the same tune for the 10th festival in a row. Perfection in public, headaches in private. That was the daily balance. And then came the fade-out. Retirement was dressed in flowery language, honoured with rest, granted serene repose. Translation: move to smaller quarters, fewer attendants. Don't call us, we'll call you. Some women did leave with stipends or remarried minor officials. Most stayed tucked away until their names quietly slipped out of memory. For people once paraded as empire's jewels, it was a disappearing act worthy of a magician. That's the harsh comedy of the harem system. You could be priceless one year, irrelevant the next. The archives adored drama, so we hear about the exiled, the executed, the politically explosive. But the quiet endings, the decades of ordinary survival, those didn't make the cut. A concubine aging out of favour wasn't history, it was just housekeeping. The result is that we know the palace in extremes, legends of women who rose high, and scandals of women who fell hard. Everyone else, the vast majority, vanished somewhere in the middle. Their daily routines, their favourite snacks, their private jokes, gone. The palace walls swallowed them whole, not by accident but by design. Modern visitors get the curated version too. You walk through the forbidden city, marvel at courtyards and golden roofs, and imagine life was glorious. What you don't see are the drafty corners where women huddled for warmth, or the storerooms that smelled faintly of mildew. The architecture stayed flawless. The human experience did not. And that's the biggest contrast of all. Concubines lived as symbols, but died as people, mostly unremembered. The empire used them as living billboards of prestige, but once their usefulness expired, their identity dissolved. It's like being a poster model for a brand that forgets your name the moment the campaign ends. So the comedy isn't in their suffering, it's in the ridiculousness of the system itself. A whole empire managed to turn ordinary lives into glittering illusions. Treasures of the nation, yes, but also women who probably spent entire afternoons debating which corner of the courtyard got the best sunlight for drying laundry. In the end, the Ming harem wasn't just a social institution, it was a giant irony machine. It promised honour and delivered chores. It projected harmony and manufactured gossip. It called women priceless, then treated them as replaceable. That's history's punchline. The palace walls stayed majestic, but the lives inside slipped into silence, proof that prestige dazzles, but memory doesn't always tag along.